It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Nir Eyal. He's the Henry Rutgers Bioethics Professor and also a former colleague of mine at Rutgers. So it's really a pleasure to be able to welcome here with us today and is also the director of the Center for Population Level Bioethics. Dr. Nir Eyal is a doctorate of philosophy from Oxford University and postdoctoral training at the National Institute of Health. He also spent time at Princeton University in their Center for Human Values. And prior to arriving to Rutgers, was at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University with an affiliation both at the Law School and the Arts and Sciences School. Dr. Eyal is also a bioethicist in the field of population and public health, and so it's really wonderful to have two leading experts in the field of population and public health bioethicists with us today. I think these talks will be wonderfully complementary and synergistic and really allow for us to think through some of the major issues that we now confront as a country with respect to how we advance population health ethics in this current urgent moment of addressing the public health of all of our communities. Dr. Eyal's work has looked at questions of bystander risk as well as ethics of human challenge trials, of which he will be speaking today. Thanks very much.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Thank you so much, Tom, for the gracious invitation and everybody for coming. And thank you, Ron, for a wonderful talk. The common denominator, if you will, between the two talks is look beyond individual patient care and the norms that are often associated with that when you are thinking about the public's health. Challenge trials on human volunteers are becoming much more common than they used to be, say 20 years ago. In a minute we'll explain what challenge trials are, but there have been challenge trials for COVID, and there is more ongoing and about to commence. So these were in London, and there is more in Oxford. Challenge trial for Zika is ongoing at Hopkins, and people are talking much more seriously about conducting a challenge trial for Hep C to develop to test the efficacy of a vaccine candidate. What are challenge trials? We're going to talk about what they are and then about their potential value. HCTs will be the acronym for human challenge trials in vaccine testing and address objections to conducting them, focusing all along on the context of COVID and challenge trials for that disease. Let's start with what they are. A human challenge trial is a trial where trialists intentionally expose participants to a pathogen. That is what makes it ethically controversial. We never, in medical care, try to expose patients to a pathogen, but this is exactly what a human challenge trial does to human participants. Depending on the design, depending on the circumstances, it can advance our scientific and medical knowledge in a certain way. You can learn certain things from it, a variety of different things. So for example, in a simple design for a COVID vaccine challenge trial that would check the efficacy of a COVID vaccine, this, by the way, is not the kind of challenge trial that was conducted in Imperial College in London. What happens there is that you have a very small number of volunteers who consent to what I've just said, to being exposed to a virus and to the rest of the details of the trial. They go to some medical facility and are randomized to, say, intervention versus control, and then all are exposed deliberately to the virus. Soon thereafter, the intervention arm gets the vaccine candidate. Say it could have been, in the first place, the vaccine candidates that we initially approved for COVID, or more contemporaneously, maybe a vaccine candidate that has some advantage over those. It can be administered orally. It can be delivered more easily in developing countries. And if there are big differences between the people who got the vaccine and those who didn't get the vaccine, that's a sign that the vaccine works and is very efficacious, If there aren't big differences, then you know that, or presumably the vaccine is not very efficacious. I'll focus specifically on a challenge trial with roughly that kind of design for the purposes of this talk, but a lot of it we could also discuss in the questions applies to other designs that would try to achieve other things by exposing people intentionally to a pathogen. So I mentioned that in Imperial College they've completed a challenge trial for COVID. I'll give you a few details on it. It was a sort of public-private partnership, and it wasn't like what I've described now. It was a single-arm trial that basically followed people and gave them a lot of exams once they were exposed. So there was it wasn't to test a vaccine. It was just to see the natural development of the disease and answer a variety of questions. These were people who were isolated in a facility in London, bored. You can give them a lot of exams. I'll argue later, they were largely there because of altruism. They want to help. They're bored. You can test a lot of stuff on them. And the researchers found a bunch of things. Not, I would say, groundbreaking, but interesting and somewhat more rigorously proven than what was known at the time from other methods. There were no severe adverse events, although one volunteer lost their sense of smell for months afterwards. The standard package, if we're talking about challenge trials, is you try to minimize the risk, of course, to the volunteers when you expose them to the pathogen. And say in COVID, the most straightforward way of doing that is not so much what you do, but the people you select. You select, COVID has such a huge age gradient, you select young adults because the quality of their consent is higher than pediatric subjects. So maybe people in their 20s. You select them to be healthy, so the comorbidities issues is not there. And you give them excellent access, preferred access, even at the time of critical shortages in critical care. You give them excellent access to care, should that become necessary. Nowadays, the time when people were discussing that, we didn't have therapeutics for COVID, of course. Now that would be part of the regimen. And they remain isolated so that you don't have, Tom Mackey mentioned that I also work on research bystanders. These are people who are not subjects, who are being put at risk by medical trials. And the paradigm example is the contact of somebody who is in a challenge study. They are not subject, but if the person goes home and infects their family, then they may suffer, and they're actually not in a medical facility. They might not be detected, so it's actually quite important. And the phenomenon of bystanders is very widespread and very interesting to explore. How do we think about the ethics of how we treat them? But you really can sever that if you isolate them until they're no longer infectious. There are interesting questions about that. Do we have a right to, block people who committed no crime in a certain medical facility until they're no longer infectious? There are some preparatory and posterior steps that you need to have in order to have a challenge trial. You need to, say, grow culture, a virus. You need to do a dose escalation study. I'm not going to go into these technicalities. You need to convert facilities. These take time. There are some things that you can do to cut some of that time. For example, Mark Lipsitch and I proposed a design for challenge trials that doesn't use cultured virus. Basically, it's not a good way to sell it, but to clarify what we're talking about, it's a kind of corona party, if you will. And there are also posterior steps. Challenge trials are on a very small group of volunteers. You don't get information about safety from them. Safety events are rare. It's not enough statistically for anything that is adequate. And you selected for young and healthy volunteers, you don't know what this does in other populations. So you need to think of maybe through immune bridging studies, how to transfer the knowledge, to generalize the knowledge to additional populations. I want to start by arguing that there was some value, considerable value, in conducting challenge trials, say in a situation of a pandemic like COVID. So I was actually the first author of the first peer-reviewed paper that suggested conducting challenge trials for COVID with Mark, whom I mentioned already, and Peter Smith from London. Soon thereafter, there were additional papers, including a WHO working group paper that were also calling for that. The Eyal paper I mentioned here is actually not, it's discussing that. It was ambivalent about whether it's for or against. I believe that there would be also roles for challenge trials for COVID later on in the pandemic, not just at these early stages of discovering the first vaccine. I'm listing some roles here. You can imagine others. Importantly, one of those roles is identifying the correlates of vaccine protection and its duration. We'll come back to that later. Some of these roles remain, I think, pertinent, but certainly extended, they remain pertinent even after the initial stage of vaccine discovery. I'm going to skip some slides. The main reason why challenge trials in the context of a pandemic can be of great social value is that they are an expedited design. So you don't, in a conventional field trial like the ones that we've conducted to discover the vaccines, you wait for enough cases to emerge of people naturally getting infected in their home environments so that you will see a difference between your intervention arm and the control arm. The intervention arm that got the vaccine candidate, say Moderna, and the control arm that got placebo. And that takes a while. And it also costs a lot of money because in order to make it not so long, we needed to have had huge numbers of volunteers. In a challenge trial, you don't need to wait, and you just go ahead and expose everybody to the virus. And that's also why you need so far fewer cases. It's really just a few dozen volunteers that would achieve the same statistical power as these huge trials that we had in terms of checking the efficacy in that population. And the huge scale of a pandemic makes expediting the process extremely important for global public health. We, at the time, wrote under the impression that everybody was under at the time that we could still achieve herd immunity if we act fast enough. We were outraged that in spring 2020, the United States under Donald Trump was doing everything not to do anything about the pandemic. We thought we could still catch it if we act fast enough, and it won't become the huge killer that it would be. So we projected the IMF and World Bank numbers at the time, the expectation with what was expected to be exponential growth in mortality. And we said, if you look at the numbers, it's just going to have a huge, huge, huge effect to expedite the processes for discovering initially the vaccine. But I believe that there are also additional roles that are relevant also after the vaccine was discovered, and they, in a pandemic context, can have a lot of value. I'm going to skip more details here. As mentioned, conventional phase 3 field trials take longer early in the pandemic, and late in the pandemic, they're also hard to justify, because at that point, around a study site, well, first there would be the challenges that always exist in field trials. It depends on what's going on around the study site. So the AstraZeneca, if you remember, trial in spring 2020 in England had to move to Brazil and South Africa because for a minute, Boris Johnson became serious about COVID, and then cases declined in the UK, and there weren't enough natural cases to sustain the trial. So they had to start completely new sites elsewhere. And that continues also late in the pandemic development, but more specifically to the late in the disease, if you want to have anything like a placebo design, that requires withholding the vaccine from thousands of placebo volunteers, jeopardizing both them and, remember the bystanders, their non-consenting contact, and that is ethically problematic. It's also impossible to find enough participants in these great numbers with neither natural nor vaccine-based protection if you want to have to test that. Nowadays, I think we would give up on trying to find volunteers with neither, but there was a long period where we could have found just a few dozen people without those, either natural or vaccine-based protection, and use that for our designs. So that wasn't available in conventional trials, but available in challenge trials. And if you want to do an equivalency design that compares two vaccine candidates, one to the other, both somewhat efficacious, but you want to check which is more efficacious and by how much, that requires even greater numbers of volunteers for statistical reasons, and that's even less realistic to achieve at some point in the pandemic with conventional designs, but realistic with these small numbers would be an increase on a few dozen volunteers, not a huge increase. So still realistic to do. But there were many objections to challenge trials, and I want to discuss the ethics of this design as well. I just realized that I forgot to press to activate my my watch, so I'm looking for Tom to tell me when I started. Fantastic. All right. A lot of objections. I'm going to discuss first some that alleged that what I said about the social value of these trials is not true. For a variety of reasons, they're not generating the results that we need. And another set of objections, which is even kind of more core ethical, was something like, look, maybe this is valuable, but you don't go ahead and expose people intentionally to pathogens just because you have something to gain from that. It's not ethical. So we'll run through the ones alleging low value. After the initial vaccines were discovered, a bunch of my colleagues argued that they're no longer relevant, but, so I'm going to come back to this, but I argue that there are plenty of more roles remaining, and I've mentioned briefly that there are some problems with conducting field trials, so they remain functional, I think, even at this point. Certainly at some earlier point in the pandemic, which were posterior to when we had the initial vaccines. They take a lot of time to set up, but there are ways to expedite that. There is no read on product safety. That's absolutely true, but we suggested in multiple articles different ways in which you could get that safety information through a separate stage, even as part of a complementary field trial, which I think is also an interesting possibility to conduct both types of trials. An important, maybe the strongest argument that there is really very little value in these trials is that you select, in order to minimize risk, only young, healthy adults for these trials. This is not the population that we're trying to develop the vaccine for the most. What do we do about that? And there were, that's basically, Eyal is the article by a group that NIH put together in order to tell it what to do about this. So, and even earlier, NIH leadership, Tony Fauci, Francis Collins, and others wrote an article in Science expounding mainly this argument against relying on challenge trials. So that was very much on their minds. Some of this problem arises also in field trials. To represent every key population with, with every comorbidity, with guarantee of sufficient case accrual is simply impossible. So for statistical reasons, you power the study to give you an answer, yes, no, not to answer about these separate populations, even if you're going to multiply it by 3 so that you can talk about huge populations, subpopulations in between, you just do not have the statistical power to answer about every comorbidity and every ethnic, racial group. I think that there is now a culture of kind of diversifying clinical trial population that is sometimes a little too hopeful about the chance of doing that through clinical trials. That's an issue that I'm interested in. It's a very important goal, but I'm not sure that we can reach it. And that might be even harder when poor countries try to develop trials to address their vaccine needs, which unfortunately rich countries were not attuned enough for during COVID. A possible solution is to conduct immune bridging studies in high-risk populations after you do your initial efficacy study, either a field study that doesn't check for every population or a challenge trial. Immune bridging studies are ones where you check only whether in the relevant population exposure just to the vaccine triggers what you know correlates with vaccine immune protection, and that's a strong sign and a very safe way of testing whether that population would be protected by the vaccine. But you need to know what correlates with vaccine protection, and everybody agrees, including, say, Deming et al., they write that the best way of checking rigorously what exactly are the correlates of vaccine protection is through a challenge design. So a challenge design, far from being super unsuccessful in helping us generalize results to many populations of patients, is actually an important stage for helping us doing so. People wrote that it would undermine trust in vaccines. We had a huge problem of trust in vaccines. We continue to have a huge problem of distrust of vaccines in the general population. People don't take the vaccine, and they said if you do this crazy thing, you infect people, like they're gonna, the vaccine skeptics will just exploit that to give you so much trouble. Bioethicists were saying that a lot. I believe it's become something of a fashion among my colleagues in bioethics to say, oh, this would undermine trust in doctors and public health authorities. And why are we saying those things? We are not empirical researchers. I'm not. My background is philosophy. How would we know? I mean, it's a complex science. What undermines trust? What builds trust? The effects are very complex. If the vaccine trials last long, they're seen maybe like a sort of lame duck, and maybe if you quickly get results, maybe that would build trust. It's a complex issue. The only available data from spring 2020 suggested, actually, it's a study of a group that I was participant in, the Brookman et al. We checked in eight countries. We compared 2 scenarios. One was, in fact, a conventional vaccine trial. Another was, in fact, a challenge trial, which ends faster, but is more risky for the participants. And there was support across countries, interestingly, and I think reassuringly, less so in Hong Kong and Singapore, which are close to China. At the time, there were rumors that China is conducting unethical challenge trials without consent. So maybe that explains it. Both among Democrats and among Republicans in America for conducting the challenge design. So we shouldn't, bioethicists like myself shouldn't presume that they know what the public would be agitated by, what the public would oppose. It's not part of our training. It's true that a trial accident might dent that support. We'll check later how high or, in fact, low is the risk of an accident. People said approval agencies would never approve vaccine candidate based on challenge trials, so what's the point? Well, the point is to try to convince the approval agencies to change their habits and convince, say, FDA or EMA, the European Medical Authority, Medicines Authority, to use those designs. In any case, there are also uses of challenge trials that complement field trials and increase the overall evidence, and surely those would be relevant for even conservative vaccine approval agencies. People said that becomes a bit more about the ethics. There are ethical issues. Sure, maybe it's got some value, but how can you, for an emerging infection, achieve informed consent? Nobody knows back in spring 2020 what SARS-CoV-2 infection does to you. What is the chance you'll be killed? We didn't even know that long COVID exists. So how can the decision to participate in such a trial be informed? Without informed consent, the trial can't be ethical. I believe that in many medical trials, the subject and the researcher don't know what the intervention, which is merely experimental, will do to them. That's why it's experimental. They need to know the ranges. It couldn't be safer than this. It couldn't be riskier than this, if those are known to science. They shouldn't be cheated about anything. And they need to know, part of being informed is to be able to say, we don't know. This is an emerging infection. There is a lot we don't know about this one. If they tell us that when we check the comprehension, I think they could be, should count as informed for the purposes. We never have full information in any context in life. Science changes, right? If 20 years after a trial, science changes and the researchers realize, oh my God, we assured people about something which actually science changed, and we now know we gave them some incorrect assurances. That doesn't mean that they're guilty of battery. They were acting in lockstep with the scientific understanding of the time. So that's okay. It's not about knowing the truth about what exactly this will do to you. It's about something that can be achieved. And in fact, there were big uncertainties, I believe, also in the vaccine trials that we did conduct at the time. One factor, for example, severity enhancement. We didn't know if the vaccine couldn't make exposure even worse for you. This had happened in other SARS vaccine candidates in animal studies. And there was real fear in the Corey et al. Is the article with Fauci and Collins that I mentioned earlier. They were afraid that this might be the case. Yet I remember they were recruiting Rutgers people for the J&J trial. So the consent form said something very minimal about severity enhancement, which we really didn't know if it's not going to happen. We were lucky and it didn't happen. And the person who was trying to explain the consent form had no idea what this is about. I think that was somewhat compromised quality of consent. In a small group of volunteers, potentially highly educated, we're going to talk about that, you have a more realistic chance of achieving higher quality of consent, actually. When you need to, J&J recruited 60,000 people. I can kind of understand why the quality of the consent wasn't optimal. I'm not being accusatory here. People said it's going to target the poor and the exploitable and the disenfranchised, the people who don't understand that this is risky business, or the people who unjustly don't have access to critical care in their country or whatnot. Otherwise, why would anybody volunteer for this? We surveyed, shortly after we wrote our article, they said, inspired by our article, emerged a global movement called One Day Sooner, which now has 40,000 plus people registered there who said we would like to volunteer for COVID challenge trials. And now this movement has morphed into a movement of volunteers who want to work in other risky studies, including, say, other challenge studies that I mentioned earlier. We surveyed them, They are very highly educated, all right to do economically, have access to health care. We also check, they are, what is typical of them is altruism. They are risk averse more than the control group that we surveyed of representative, a sample of US, of Americans. So they're more risk averse, but they're just altruistic and they understand what they're getting into. They're highly educated. They want to help. So when we think of trial volunteers, we often, in research ethics, we often have a picture of some of the most egregious trials that have taken place and which totally exploited the lack of alternatives economically or medically or lack of health literacy. But there's nothing in the nature of health research that prevents also a sort of idyllic situation, and we should remain open to the possibility that we are talking about volunteers who are not like in the worst scare stories that I was educated on when I was studying research ethics. It's something to guard against, but it's not necessary. Core issue is, okay, but it's unfair to expose people to this level of risk. Even if they volunteer, that's not enough. You need to give them some sort of fair risk-benefit calculation. Everybody agrees that there are three key ethical questions about the risk to the volunteer, especially in these early situations where we didn't have anything like therapeutics, nothing to do if things start going south. One question, and that's not just, say, me, I'm in favor of challenge trials, but also, say, Seema Shah and colleagues Seema Shah personally is against challenge trials. One question is whether the net risks to each volunteer have been minimized while keeping the study scientifically valid. WHO working group said, yes, there have been many measures, say, especially the choice of young, healthy adults that provide that. But there are other questions. Is the social value of the study sufficient in order to warrant imposing these net risks on the participant? Note the way this question is phrased. The claim is not there is no net risk to the participant. The claim is not this is in the interest of their medical care. It's not in your interests. As a clinician, you wouldn't recommend under your hat as clinician to your patient to be part of that trial. But people do a lot of things for the sake of others. They volunteer, they donate money. You don't gain as much happiness. You gain maybe some happiness from donating money, but maybe not enough. Whenever I donate some money, it makes me happy for 2 minutes after I go, oh, great. But then that disappears and I lost money, right? It's not good for you necessarily to act altruistically, but it's legitimate to act altruistically in many contexts. And if I'm right that there is social value, then I want to argue if the social value, especially because in a pandemic situation, I argue the social value can be very high, this can be enough. But there were also ones who said, okay, there is more social value than what is lost in prospect by the participant, but it's just not legit because what is lost is so extreme. You can't sacrifice individuals even for a lot of social value. There are some risks which are way beyond what we can approve. There is a cap on how much risk there can be in clinical trials, even for the most important purposes. I'm going to zoom through a bunch of slides on this. This is not an element of the American regulations, but of some regulations around the world. They do endorse this element 3. But I want to argue that the risks in these trials were much lower than imagined. I'm going to zoom through a lot because I see Tom already giving me signs. Seema Shah et al. Mentioned the possibility that there is 1% of death. Then they kind of settled on anything between 0.2 of a percent and 0.03%. A month later, 2 of the authors published something that said actually, whoops, I'm skipping a lot. It's 0.007. Eventually, David Mannheim and colleagues said it's this. It's 0.0026. That's much less than the risks initially imagined. If I had time, would argue that the truth is even a bit lower than that. And it was at the time even a bit lower than that. This is nowhere near the range, in a word, this is nowhere near the range that bioethicists who believe that there are some caps on the maximal risk to human subjects, just because they throw out the number, it can't be above 1%, or it can't be the sort of risk of, say, organ transplantations for the sake of others that are beyond the pale, that are too dangerous. It's nowhere near the risk of, say, right liver lobe transplantation. It's much safer. It was much safer than that. There are also additional ways in the design to make it even lower. I do want to mention one little thing, if I may. Right now, there is a paper under consideration by Dave Wender and myself that argues right now, because basically Omicron kills about 1/8 of the people infected by it than earlier strains killed, and JN1 in particular basically doesn't kill young, healthy volunteers. The risks of death are way lower than they were even at the time. So the numbers now would be well below 1 in 100,000 chance of death. They may well be below 1 in 500,000 chance of death. And that puts it in a special range, which the federal regulations in 2018 call minimal risk studies. So that's really striking. Even I am kind of a little puzzled by this. It means we can do it, expedited, without consent. So certainly not the kind of trial that you would say, the US basically at the time said, that's for the Brits. We don't allow this kind of thing in America. That's not the sort of approach that you would take to such a study. If I had time, I would discuss the risk of a terrible accident in such a trial, which might undermine public trust. Remember, in a word, there are only a few dozen volunteers, so then the risks per individual, which is what we discussed so far, are multiplied not by a huge number. That would be the risk of a terrible accident in the trial at large, and I think that's also acceptable. And I want to conclude and say that these trials may turn out to facilitate important discoveries even now, and that like other medical trials and practices, challenge trials to assess the efficacy of the vaccine candidates at the time would have put participants at substantial risks, but that if done right, the risks, which are not eliminable, remain acceptable, and that the other ethical objections to conducting these trials can be met. Although, and that is, in a way, bring us back to the connection to Ron's contribution, although they are not at all what a clinician would recommend to her own patient for medical reasons. Medical trials, I see here a lot of people in white robes. Some people have suggested maybe medical trials should be conducted by people in red robes or some other. It's not the same set of clinical obligations that exist in the clinic. It's a sort of different ethical animal, and we should think of the ethics of clinical trials differently than the ethics of clinical care. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Eyal. Wonderful talk, really fascinating. I will go ahead and turn it over to Sheldon here to ask the first question.
Thank you so much. But I have two questions for you. One is about the role of regulators on this. So one of the most, in a sense, weird and famous trials was the hepatitis B vaccine, which came out in 1981 as the AIDS epidemic was going on. The vaccine was derived from the blood of gay men and IV drug users, because they had Australia antigen. The government said, this is safe. We did not know. We did not have an agent. We knew about prions, which we couldn't detect and couldn't denature. Is that a, so that's one example of a human trial, derived from blood of an infection in the population from which the vaccine was drawn. The second example of a human trial was the birth control pill. The birth control pill, when it was initially licensed, okay, had more than 50 times the dose of estrogen that was needed. It was done on 50 people, 50 women initially, and then 200. And then once it was licensed, it was 10 million. So are these just examples of the regulators making a national trial, okay, with no data? We had the hardest time in 1982 to try and get our house officers to take the hepatitis B vaccine. Perfectly reasonable. So where does that fit on your spectrum of things? Were these unethical decisions? Were these? I'd like to sort of hear your thoughts on it.
It sounds like two examples, and I'm not familiar with either of the cases in detail. So it sounds like two cases where there was error. There should not have been the conclusion that this is ready to roll out. I don't. In the first case, if I understand correctly, maybe a condonable error because it wasn't known. So if I understand correctly, HIV infection wasn't a known thing back when. I see. So it was just negligence. Yeah. I'm happy that I'm not here to protect their position.
Dr. Eyal, I had a question as well. I found really interesting the notion of the impossibility of informed consent, and I think one of the concerns that arise to me in the context of these human challenge trials is the potential for populations who are already systematically marginalized to potentially shoulder a disproportionate amount of the risk for participation, whether that be through economic marginalization or otherwise. And I'm just curious if you could help us think through some of what we have to consider to ensure that this isn't a disproportionately affecting communities that are already systematically marginalized in various ways.
Great. So, as mentioned, Tom, we did actually survey the volunteer group from whom many of the actual trial volunteers in London and in Oxford now have come, and I think also the trial for Zika that's happening in Hopkins. And they are overall super kind of fine SES in the American context. So that's just to establish that it can happen, that it won't be the disenfranchised, etc. One could take, if you wanted, you could exclude people unless they are, do you have so the person who founded One Day Sooner had his BA from Stanford. Is it Stanford or is it just, Rutgers? No, competence. Maybe we don't want to go there, but we do the same things that we do in medical trials in general. What we do is we should check very well, not like the people checked when they were trying to recruit 60,000 volunteers on a short notice, but ideally we should check comprehension. We have tests for that. It's like the computer programs that force all of us to pretend to harass less than we in fact do, or you can't move to the next stage until you prove your comprehension level. This is already known to research ethicists, how you can use those tools. People improve those tools. So you use the usual tools. If it's a trial which is especially risky or especially in the public's eye, And you really don't want anybody recruited just because of lack of health literacy or whatnot, or lack of any alternative. You could use an especially rigorous standard of informed consent. I would recommend, for example, something that might be useful for many clinical trials, that the team that conducts the informed consent drill is not the trial team. These can be specialists in conveying information to lay populations, which scientists often, that's an expertise that we lack. And they are not as conflicted as the trialist who's trying to recruit people and get this over with. They also shouldn't be accountable to the trial team in any way, so there are ways to, so that's something that we should still develop. I would recommend that for many clinical trials, not just for these particularly risky clinical trials.
Great, thank you. Do we have any last question for our speaker? Dr. Eyal, thank you so much. This was a really fascinating conversation.
Thanks so much for a great question.
Thank you.